Hi, students. This video is your introduction to Essay 4. You guys have done so well in this class. 5-week classes are so challenging. So keep up the good work for this last week. This is the final push. I'm going to go over the assignment. I know it can be really overwhelming to hear the words research paper. But I promise you, I've broken up the assignment into baby steps. And if you just, instead of thinking about the whole thing at once, if you just focus on the next thing that's due, the next step, you will get through it. So in our essay 4, you're going to be researching social issues related to the literature we have read this semester. So for your fourth paper for this class, you're going to write a research paper on a social issue related to the literature we've read this semester. For this essay, you are required to do outside research, which should include at a minimum at least 6 outside sources which you find through the GCC library. That is not counting the material we read in the course, though those articles may certainly be included on your works cited page and cited in the paper. But could also include reputable websites. At least one of your sources should be a primary source. That's a first person source. So for example, one of the options is to write about equal pay for equal work. And you would, in that case, you might want to find an interview or a speech or something by somebody who found out they were making, like a woman who found out she was making less than her male coworkers. Lilly Ledbetter is a really famous American who fought for equal pay for equal work, and there are a bunch of speeches she gave that you can find through the database. So that would be a first person source for that topic because it's somebody who has personal experience with the topic. The central question you should explore in this essay is, to what extent is the social issue raised by a work of literature we read still important today? By a work of literature we read, still important today? If it is no longer important, explain why. If it is still important, explain why. It's perfectly okay and encouraged to say it both is and isn't important, or that the issue has changed, and to explain how it has changed. It all depends on what you find in your research. So one thing I often say to students, if you find the answer to a question is mixed, for example, I just mentioned the possible topic of equal pay for equal work. If you find we're going to read an essay this week in which Virginia Woolf talks about how women do not have the same access to resources as men. And that was published in 1929. Well, probably in your essay, you're going to make the case that things are somewhat better for women now than they were in 1929. But there are still inequities. And that's great because that gives you a lot of stuff to explain. This paper is 6 to 8 pages long. So you want things to be a little complex, because in explaining the complexities, it's going to be an interesting paper, first of all, to go into those complexities. And second of all, you're going to have enough to write about for 6 to 8 pages. So don't be afraid of complexity. That's why we write papers, so we think through all these complex issues and learn about them and convey them to others, explain them to others. You are welcome to pick a social issue not represented in the suggested topics I give here, but please if you make up your own topic, please run it by me first. But I found that students really like suggested topics, so I've given you a bunch here. So the first one is about sweat. So an obvious social issue raised by sweat is sort of the fight between labor, which is how people commonly refer to labor unions, the fight between labor and employers. And there's a lot going on actually in the labor movement right now. In fact, I could give you one more link. I just realized maybe I'll post it on the module. First of all, there's a real resurgence of unions right now. There are many reasons, but one obvious reason is COVID, that a lot of workers really reflected during the pandemic, and they're kind of organizing and wanting to be treated better by their bosses. So there's a real resurgence in strikes and unions in workers at companies wanting to form unions. Like there's been a lot written about workers at Amazon and Starbucks forming unions. And as they try to do that, there are a lot of union busting efforts where companies like Amazon in particular and Target, I think, has done this too, are fighting really hard to keep their employees from unionizing. So that might be an interesting thing to write about. There was a really good segment on John Oliver's TV program about that, which you could use as a source. I've given you a link to that there. So research and write about union busting efforts and how such efforts might relate to the problems faced by the workers Lynn Nottage writes about in Sweat. There was also, you could probably Google this, there's a really good podcast called The Daily that's put out by the New York Times, and they recently did, maybe it was in June, might have been May, they did an episode, just a 30-minute episode about the resurgence in unions. So that might be another good source. And that might be a slightly different topic. You might write about the resurgence in unions instead of union busting efforts, or you could write about both. Also, there was a really interesting story on National Public Radio. I think it was last week. I gave you the link to it. About exotic dancers in Hollywood who are trying to unionize. So that's sort of a local slant on that issue. You could use that as a source. Another possible source is resilience. All the characters in Sweat are trying to kind of rebuild their lives as they face enormous pressures. You could research and write about what scientists have learned about how to develop resilience and encourage it in others. You might also research and write about shame, which the parole officer Evan in the play tells Jason and Chris can be an obstacle to rebuilding your life after tragedy. What does the research show about what shame is and how it can negatively affect our ability to heal and move forward after traumatic events? And what does the research show about how to deal with shame? And I gave you a link to some TED Talks on shame that are really good, which you could use as sources. In Sweat, Oscar implies he and his father are not allowed into the union because of racism. Research and write about the history of racism and sexism in unions. You might even write about a current controversy in Los Angeles that suggests the firefighters union has created a hostile workplace for female firefighters. The LA Times has published a bunch of stories about this problem in the firefighters union. There's a lot of female firefighters have been harassed and intimidated. And recently the mayor appointed the first female fire chief, kind of, I think, as a response to what was going on. So any of that you could write about, and you could relate it to the ways racism comes up in Sweat. In What the Living Do, Marie Howe writes many poems about her brother John, who died of AIDS in 1989. In the video we watched about AIDS, we learned that homophobia was a real obstacle to finding good treatments for AIDS and finding a cure for AIDS. So there are many topics you could research here. You could research the role ACT UP played in finding good treatment for AIDS patients. Was an organization that formed to protest a lack of treatment for AIDS patients. There's a fantastic documentary about ACT UP called How to Survive a Plague, which you could use as a source. You might also look at what the data show about the ways racism affects healthcare and what steps are being taken to make healthcare more equitable. So this came up a lot during the COVID pandemic. There was Black and brown people were dying at a much higher rate than white people. And we were all rightly alarmed by that. So is that because of racism? That would be a really interesting thing to research. I know some of you are thinking about going into nursing. So there's really interesting data about homophobia, racism, sexism. In fact, I just heard you can find data on any of that and efforts to kind of find solutions to that problem. I also just heard that there's been some data that obese people die at a higher rate of COVID, and they actually haven't found a scientific reason for that, but they have found some evidence that obese people with COVID are given certain kind of treatments later than people who aren't obese, so that there may be some kind of discrimination there, that doctors treat obese people differently than they treat people who are not obese. So it's very complicated, but that might be an interesting thing to study, and you could relate it to what the living do. Even if you're writing about racism, you could just talk about the issue of discrimination in healthcare and how it impacts patients. Many of the works we've read this semester have dealt with death and have encouraged us to look at death as not as something scary and dreadful, but as something that we might face with courage, peace, and even curiosity. You could research and write about the hospice movement and how it is encouraging terminally ill patients and their families to consider the concept of the good death. And how it is challenging mainstream views of the end of life, much like several of the works we read in class do. So 30 years ago, when somebody was dying, sort of the attitude was keep them alive as long as possible, give them as much treatment to prolong their life, no matter what. And the hospice movement sort of changed that thinking. If somebody knows for sure they're going to die, they might not want any kind of treatment. They might decide chemotherapy is too difficult, and I would rather have a good quality of life for 3 months than be suffering the effects of chemotherapy for 6 months. So the hospice movement was really a big movement for changing the ways we think about death. So in much the same way that some of the poems we read sort of encouraged us to look at death differently. This week we're reading a really great essay by Virginia Woolf called What If Shakespeare Had a Sister? And in it, Virginia Woolf kind of examines the fact that women do not have the same access to resources as men. And as I said earlier, that was written about 100 years ago now. You could revisit that topic. Have things gotten better for women? To what extent? And I think it's really important for this topic to focus it some. So either focus it on equal pay for equal work. You might look at rape culture. You might look at the issue of domestic abuse. You might look at what research reveals about how heterosexual married couples divide up housework. I just heard a really good interview. Gavin Newsom, our governor's wife, I think her name is Jennifer Newsom, has a new documentary out about that issue. You could use that as a source about housework and how it's divided up. I've given you some other sources there. So there are lots of things you could write about for that one too. Virginia Woolf's essay also suggests that men and women, and by implication other groups who often are discriminated against, such as people of color, might have more equality if they had equal access to resources. So one thing that's happening in this country now is a lot of cities are experimenting with universal basic income programs. The first city to do this was Stockton, California. And what they did is they gave people that did not have a lot of money an extra $500 a month just to see if that would help these people improve their life situation. And what they found was poor people, essentially, who got an extra $500 a month, used that money to improve their situation. So they might use the $500 to take a day off their current job, get some clothes for an interview, and go to a job interview. Or it might help them, I don't know, buy a car or make a car payment or get off the streets if they were homeless. So it was proven to be really successful. And now a lot of cities, including Los Angeles, are doing it. I know in Los Angeles, they're giving a lot of people who were foster kids a universal basic income. So you could research and write about that and discuss how it relates to Wolf's argument. When people are given more resources, are they able to do more? Do they have more options for things like better employment or education? We think a lot that, if somebody can just get a better job, then their situation will improve and they will make more money. But the people who believe in universal basic income say, well, sometimes it takes a little money to get a better job or to get an education. So it's a really interesting thing that's happening in our country. All right. Well, this assignment is designed to give you some freedom in the selection of your topic. Whatever topic you choose, you should design an essay that in some way explores a social issue raised by a work of literature we've read and discuss whether that social issue is still important today. In your essay, you should also draw connections between what you learned from your research and the work of literature we read that connects to the social issue you're writing about. There are many ways you can approach your topic, but probably in terms of organizing, you're going to have an introduction with a thesis, distinct supporting sections, a conclusion, and a works cited page. It's not a research paper if it doesn't have a works cited page. So just remember, no works cited page, no grade. You've got to have a list of resources. The other thing I really want to convey to you is that it's really tempting when you're working on a research paper to think, oh, equal pay for equal work. I know what I think about that. I'm going to go find sources that support my point of view on that topic. That is a much harder way to do a research paper. A much easier way to do a research paper is think about which topics you're kind of interested in, go into the database. I've got a whole different video about the database, but you probably know a little bit about it if you took the library workshops. Go into the database, look around, see what kind of sources you find, see what seems interesting to you, see what you feel engaged with, find your 6 sources, read them all, keep your mind open to the possibility that they might give you new insights or make you think about the topic in new ways. Hopefully that's what's going to happen in this project. You just might have more information about a topic. And then after you've read all your sources, thought about them, done your annotated bibliography, which is going to be due Wednesday, then start thinking about what you might write about. So let the resources, the sources you read and the research you do shape your thesis and the outline of your paper and all of that. It's much better to draft your thesis after you've read all your sources. It's much easier than kind of having your thesis in your head and trying to shoehorn your sources into your preconceived idea. It's also just much more fun to do that paper that way, to let it be kind of a discovery process, and let your thesis be about what you discovered. Your grade on this assignment is based on your grades on preliminary work on the assignment, plus the quality of the final paper received. So you cannot just turn in a final paper next Sunday. Or if you do, that's only 60% of your grade. So the highest grade you can get on essay 4 is a 60 if you do that. 40% of your grade on this assignment is turning in a work for the preliminary steps to get to the final draft. So, and that's all broken down here. 5% of your grade is turning in a works cited page with your 6 tentative sources, one of which is going to be a primary source by Tuesday. 5% of your grade is going to be your annotated bibliography, which is due Wednesday. An annotated bibliography is basically a works cited page with summaries. You're going to write your own original summary of each source you use. Make sure not to use a summary that's from the database. All the annotated bibliographies will, of course, go through a plagiarism checker, and I won't accept it if any of those summaries are copied from the database. A free write and or a list of what you've learned about your topic, also due on Wednesday. There's a video about how to do a works cited page. There's a video about how to do an annotated bibliography. There's a video about how to do the free write in the list, and how to turn that list into your outline, which is due Thursday. Then the first couple pages of your rough draft are also due Thursday, the introduction and the first supporting section. And then a complete typed rough draft is due on Friday. That's the hardest step. And then your final draft is due on Sunday. This paper should be 6 to 8 pages long, not including the works cited page. So that is the basic rundown. Please note that you do need to quote from your sources in this essay. A good way to, you don't have to quote from every source. You do have to use information from every source, but you're not going to use the same amount of information from every source. You might think about it like if you're baking a cake, you're not going to use the same amount of salt as sugar, right? You might just take 1 tablespoon of something from one source and then a half a cup or 2 cups of something from another source. So read all your sources, figure out what you want to share about your topic, and then organize your thoughts in an outline, and then use details and examples and data and information from your sources to support what you most want to share about your topic. There'll be lots of videos about this. So we'll talk about it more. The most common question, but you do need to use some quotes. I'd say somewhere between 3 and 10 quotations in this essay. So make sure you do that. And there'll be a video about how to cite quotations. The biggest question I get about this paper is students sometimes kind of freak out about not having enough to say. So the secret to getting to 6 to 8 pages is having good details. So, and examples. So if you're writing about equal pay and equal work, make sure you're including a lot of details and examples. And if you're only at page 4 and you have nothing else to say, you might need to look at a different aspect of that topic. For example, how when women make less money than men, how that affects their retirement savings. You might look at how women of color make even less than white women. So the comparison to white men is in terms of pay is even more extreme. I can help you with any of this. The librarians can help you with any of this. But the secret to getting to enough length is details and examples. And sometimes you just need someone like me to look at your paper and say, oh, I know another aspect of this you could discuss. We'll talk about that more this week. All right, I've gone on and on, so I'm going to stop, but let me know what your questions are. And if possible, like I said in an announcement last week, if you have questions, if possible, ask them in the group Pronto thread, because probably your questions are questions other students have, and then everybody can see my answers. That'll help everybody. But I'd much rather you message me privately than not message me at all if you're just too shy to ask a question in the whole group thread. All right, let me know what you need.